Oh, look, it's...
Hi!
I'm good, how are you? Just do she said go in.
Sometimes people have to. Thank you so much. I'll bring the pen back after.
I appreciate it.
Thanks. I'll be right back.
Thank you.
I got a seat up in the middle of the aisle. So.
You're so right off South Street.
Oh, I work right here.
Really?
I work on Wall Street.
I live on Water Street.
Oh, I used to work on Wall Street. 175 what? But now I'm at 41. Well, how do you like it that they're so dead?
It's dead, but like where I live in one of the areas.
Over there, it's like super funny. It's like after a certain amount of time on the weekend, it's like, you know, they have
Good evening. Good evening and welcome to Voices Against Torture, Writers and Lawyers on the Way Forward. I'm Fernandez, the Associate Director of Programs of the American Constitution Society for Law and Policy, otherwise known as ACS. For those of you who are unfamiliar with ACS, we are a national network of lawyers, law students, scholars, and policymakers dedicated to ensuring that principles of human dignity, equality, liberty, and access to justice retain their rightful, central role in American law and policy. Aside from our substantive work, we are also about the business of building a progressive infrastructure. That work involves partnering with groups whose work we admire, groups who do programming that is thought-provoking and meaningful, groups just like the PEN American Center. A huge thanks to PEN for co-sponsoring tonight's event, and in particular, thanks to Larry Seams, Elizabeth Weinstein, and Carol Wellen for making this collaboration such an enjoyable experience. I hope it's the first of many. Okay, I'm of the opinion that anything that delays you from hearing this panel is a bad thing. So without further ado, while our moderator will introduce our distinguished panelists, I'm going to introduce our moderator, Dahlia Lithwick. Dahlia is a senior editor and legal commentator for Slate, where she writes the popular Supreme Court Dispatches column. You may know her also from her NPR legal commentary or her pieces in the Washington Post, the New York Times, the New Republic, and other publications. For those of you who think that a discussion of serious legal issues can't be also had with serious wit, I introduce you to Dahlia Lithwick. Thanks.
Thank you all so much for braving the weather to join us today. I want to also say thank you to the American Constitution Society and to the Pan American Center for assembling this truly extraordinary panel that you see before you. There have been and will continue to be many, many discussions about torture. Everybody on this panel has probably done dozens over the last 8 years. This one's going to be a little bit different because we're going to talk about writing about torture tonight, and we're going to talk about the intersection of words and language and writing and torture, either as lawyers, as journalists, as novelists, and so that's our theme tonight. We're going to talk about the role that words played in the development of the torture program under the Bush administration. We're going to talk about the role words and language have played in calling the administration out for the torture program. Before I introduce the panelists, I think we should just stipulate to certain facts. And I'm going to call them facts because they were confirmed last week by a report that came out of the Senate Armed Services Committee. This was a report that was unanimously supported by along both sides of the aisle. And the Levin McCain report found, among other things, I think confirmed, I can say among other things, that the U.S. has engaged in torture, that is engaged in illegal torture, that despite attempts to blame torture on rotten apples at the lowest ends of the totem pole, this was a policy that was consciously adopted at the highest levels of government. I think we can stipulate that this policy has not made America safer. In fact, the report says, quote, the policy of torture has, quote, strengthened the hand of our enemies and compromised our moral authority. And so the questions for the panel today are not simply, how did this happen? How did we get here? And not simply, what do we do about it? Although those are important questions. It's also a very urgent question about how we talk about it and how we talk about it going forward. I'm delighted to introduce the panelists. You should all have on your chairs a longer version of the biographies, and each of them deserves an even longer version than that. But in alphabetical order, directly to my left, I'm delighted to welcome Anwar Ben Malek, a novelist, journalist, mathematician, and poet, author of the award-winning The Lovers of Algeria and The Child of an Ancient People. Ben Malek fled from France in 1992 to escape Islamist death threats, holds both Algerian and French citizenships. He became a co-founder of the Algerian Committee Against Torture and an editor of the Black Book of October, a collection of testimonies given by victims of torture by the Algerian state. At the far left, Scott Horton, a legal affairs and national security contributor to Harper's Magazine and indispensable blogger on the issue of torture. He's an adjunct professor at Columbia Law School and specializes in human rights law. Recently, he led a number of studies of issues associated with the conduct of the War on Terror for the New York City Bar Association, where he has chaired several committees, including the Committee on International Law. To the far right, Elisa Massimino is CEO and Executive Director of Human Rights First, instrumental in the organization's recent efforts to assemble a group of retired generals and admirals to speak out publicly against policies authoring the torture of prisoners in U.S. custody. She serves as an adjunct professor at Georgetown University Law Center, where she teaches human rights advocacy. And finally, directly to my right, Jim Lehr, author and staff writer for The New Yorker, and author and co-author of several books, but most recently The Dark Side, the inside story of how the War on Terror turned into a war on American ideals, a finalist for the 2008 National Book Award. And just in the interest of props, here's her book. You should all race out and buy it. I think it's one of the most important books of the past year. So on that note, I'm going to turn to the panelists to each give an opening statement between 5 and 7 minutes if we can. And I'm going to ask each panelist to really think through the questions I've asked. How did we get here? What do we do about it? Where are we going? I should add, this is Edward translator. We're going to start with the lawyers and move on to the writers, simply because I think that in some sense, the writers and the novelists have a tougher job. The lawyers have to convince a court that torture matters. The writers have to convince the rest of us. So I'm delighted to welcome Scott to give his opening remark.
So thank you, Talia. So we lawyers, even when we're writers, we're still principally lawyers. And that's the perspective I want to bring to this evening. I think I want to look forward. How does America proceed to deal with this torture legacy that's being left behind by the Bush administration? And maybe we can just start with a question: can Barack Obama end torture on January 20th? And the answer is yes, he can. In fact, there are 3 points. He's promised to close Guantanamo. What does that mean? 3 things he can do on his first day in office, very cleanly, very simply. One of them is he can issue an executive order that provides that the program, George Bush referred to it with a personal pronoun, my program. I'm delighted to see him exercise a personal interest in it. He is responsible for it. He can order that the program be discontinued. And specifically, he can also direct that the intelligence service, the CIA, abide by the same rules with respect to intelligence interrogations that bind the uniformed military today. That was a legislative initiative that Elisa Massimino and her group, among others, played a big role in last year against the opposition of the Bush administration. But Barack Obama can implement that with a stroke of the pen. Secondly, he can end the process of extraordinary renditions. That's a strange legalism, extraordinary renditions. What does it mean? It means torture by proxy. Because even though the Bush administration was happy to use all sorts of techniques, like waterboarding, long time standing, hypothermia, and as we're going to be hearing shortly, the use of psychotropic drugs, the Bush administration wouldn't use all sorts of other techniques, but it was happy to deliver prisoners to other nations that use those techniques. Morocco, Tunisia, for instance, a number of others. Barack Obama can terminate that program with a stroke of the pen. Third, the military commissions, which are referred to by some of their participants as the puppet theater in Guantanamo. That includes the prosecutors who have referred to it that way to me. He can order the commissions to stand down and stop operations on the first day. The Bush administration right now is working feverishly to impede Barack Obama's accomplishment of his promise. You're reading this in the newspapers every day. You're hearing intelligence experts tell us, oh, when he is settled with these burdens, he's going to realize he really can't do these things. It's impossible to do these things. I'm told by one prosecutor in the Guantanamo team that they've been put under pressure by the Bush administration to bring a whole series of new cases just before Barack Obama is sworn in, all designed to embarrass, obfuscate, delay, complicate his implementation of his pledge against torture. But Barack Obama, I think, should have the moral resolve, I think will have the moral resolve to act on all these things. But having done that, does that mean that torture is over forever as a matter of policy in the United States? No, it isn't. No, it isn't, because the Bush administration has established a precedent. We have a legal system that operates on the basis of precedents. The power and authority of the presidency is measured largely by what presidents in the past have done and gotten away with. And it has been a central tenet of this administration, the Bush-Cheney, maybe we should refer to it as the Cheney shogunate, in fact, for these purposes. It has been a central tenet that torture is a policy alternative that every president has and he can resort to if he chooses. By the way, of course, once he does so, he's instantly going to define whatever he does as not torture, which is his way of avoiding federal criminal statutes in the United States that make torture unlawful. And that also explains the need for people like John Yoo, who will render any legal opinion you ask them to render. So how do we get beyond this issue of precedent? And the answer to that question is found on the last page of the summary of the 29-page report that was issued by Senators Levin and McCain, that Dahlia already referred to. It said, these facts cry out for accountability. In fact, when John McCain was asked, what do you mean accountability? He said, well, it's not for me to answer that question. And I understand that there were individuals in the White House who had something of a shock hearing that, because of course they expected him to push back on that issue. But neither John McCain nor any other member of the Senate committee who were involved in this investigation, and there were 12 Republican senators involved in the investigation, were prepared to defend or push back on this, because I believe most of them feel strongly that there should be some sort of action taken. You should all obtain that 29-page report. It's just a summary. And the whole report, which is more than 100 pages long and in great detail, has not been released because it's filled with classified information. Why is that? Because when the Bush administration violates the law, and torture is a violation of the law, it cloaks its conduct in secrecy and security classifications. I don't think we're going to see that report declassified for public consumption until the Bush administration has left office. But I think after it has left office, we're going to be learning a lot more about the details of these operations. I think there's quite a bit more to learn. So how can President Obama secure the confidence and trust of the world in America's commitment to abide by its international law obligations? Hell, to abide by American criminal law. How can he do that? He can do that by ferreting out all the facts and publishing them so that the American public knows, which I think is best pursued by a commission of inquiry. And then when that commission finds, as it will, that serious criminal conduct occurred, by having his Attorney General appoint a special prosecutor to fully investigate allegations of crimes and bring prosecutions as required. And I have a recommendation to the President-elect as to who should do this. I think it's time for Patrick Fitzgerald to be brought back to Washington. And I think it's time for him to have another pass at Dick Cheney. Since he told some of his friends that he feels he didn't quite take it as far the first time as he should have. It's time for him to have a second opportunity. And I think we'll all see this is going to do wonders for the American Constitution, for the rule of law in this country, and for America's image in the world today. Thank you.
The other attorney on the panel, Ellie.
Thanks, Talia. Can you hear me okay? I'm going to have to, this is attached, so I'm going to have to lean forward. Thank you all for coming out here in this rough weather. If you had to schlep as much in the snow as I did, I really, really thank you. It's true that I've been on a lot of panels about torture, with some of the people on this panel, as Dahlia said. But the reason why I was so intrigued by this one is because it touches on an issue that we really haven't addressed yet in all the panels that I've been in and the discussions that I've had. And it's the one that really, I think, is the most, in some ways, the most important and the most infuriating to those of us who've been trying to push for change in this area. And that is, you know, we have President Obama do, I brought these all for you, it's a blueprint, how to end torture, how to close Guantanamo, and we have all these steps, first month, 6 months. But what's not in here, and what really doesn't get much attention, is how do we, as Americans, reclaim the language that is used to describe these horrible abuses. And this is something that's very, I mean, I don't know if you saw recently, I guess it was just this, on Sunday, the Vice President still pushing this idea that, you know, and there's a reason for it. I think, you know, when you say we can stipulate that the United States is engaged in torture, yes, we can stipulate that. But as I travel around the country, I can tell you that this is not broadly accepted by Americans, our fellow Americans. Most of them define torture as something we would not do. And that's the definition. If we do it, then it's not torture. And the Bush administration has been very, very successful at changing people's mindsets about how we think about these terrible things. And that's why I think one of the most important things that we have to do is get information out about not definitions. The definitions are in the law. Dahlia asked us to talk about the law. You know, international law defines torture. It also says that countries should not send people to places where there's a substantial likelihood that they would be tortured. The domestic law defines and criminalizes torture. The idea that torture is, or the Geneva Conventions say, or cruel treatment is somehow unclear, is a brand new concept with this administration. And yet now it is widely accepted, I think, that torture is something that we would not do. The fact that it's something we did do has not yet created the kind of cognitive dissonance that we need broadly in order to fix this. I think one of the most important things that we have to do going forward is to reclaim the language. And that is that's a job not so much for the lawyers, but for the writers. And it could not be more important. I think, you know, as you read, and the press has not been supremely helpful to us in this struggle to reclaim language. You know, torture, if you read any article about torture, almost all of them refer to a technique as harsh or severe or tough. Parenthetically, something human rights groups or some critics of the administration describe as torture. That is that's the way this is talked about broadly in public. And so those of us who believe that the law means what it meant when it was enacted are considered somehow a fringe group that's pushing an alternate reality on the American public. That's a very, very steep hill that we have to climb and get over. And I do think that there's quite a bit that President-elect Obama can do, even starting now, but really starting with the inaugural address, to start to reclaim this language. And one of the things I think we need to do in order to bring more people in this country along that journey is to say, for the president to say, and we've urged him to say in the inaugural address and elsewhere in executive order, that we will never do to a prisoner anything that we would not accept being done to our own people in enemy custody. That way we get away from the battle about the definitions, the legal definitions. The problem here is that the lawyers. It was learning. I've been working on these issues for 20 years, and as a lawyer, and it was somewhat of a shock to me to see how little the law mattered, and really how important the lawyers were, for better or for worse. And I think there's a lesson in that in terms of what we do going forward. I think we don't necessarily need a whole lot of new laws. There are plenty of laws on this. What we need is good faith interpretation of those laws, and more broadly, to reclaim the language of torture so that it means what it means. So I think I'll stop there and thank you for discussion.
If it's true that lawyers are constrained by technical definitions, novelists are not. And so I'm going to ask Anwar to give us his side of which is the other side of this question.
Excuse me, I'm going to speak in French because I speak only what is called dead automation. Permettez-moi de vous remercier de votre invitation à venir discuter de ce sujet-là, la torture, à un moment d'enthousiasme anxieux et d'enthousiasme quand même pour l'avenir de notre pays, avenir qui me concerne également.
I would like to thank you for this invitation to talk about torture at this moment, which is of tremendous enthusiasm and excitement at a moment which is crucial for your country.
Le pessimisme dans le domaine de la torture semble être l'attitude la moins déraisonnable.
Pessimism when torture is concerned seems to be the less unreasonable position.
Même si souvent, pour les besoins de la cause, je m'efforce publiquement ou je fais semblant d'être optimiste.
Even though, for the sake of the cause, I try in public to be optimistic.
Un confrère écrivain désespérément ironique avait inventé le mot de peptimiste.
One of my colleagues, fellow novelists, had invented a particularly savvy word, which was pessimism.
Être le plus pessimiste possible afin d'être toujours sur ses gardes, dans le but non pas d'abandonner le combat, mais d'être encore plus vigilant.
To be as pessimistic as possible in order not to stop the fight, but to be as vigilant as possible.
Pour quelqu'un comme votre visiteur, le plus terrible dans la lutte pour la promotion des droits humains, en particulier pour les plus vitaux comme le respect absolu de l'intégrité de la personne humaine,
For someone like your visitor, in order to fight for human rights, and in particular for the rights of the person,
et de découvrir à quel point les convictions des peuples sur ce point-là sont fragiles et susceptibles de se transformer en leur contraire sous la pression d'événements traumatisants, pour peu que les pouvoirs en place sachent comment les utiliser.
it is particularly hard for people. It's particularly crucial to discover how people's conviction on this point are fragile and capable of transforming themselves into their contrary under the pressure of traumatizing events, especially if powers in place know how to use them.
Tout gouvernement, même démocratique, est tenté par l'usage de la force.
Every government, even democratic government, are tempted by the use of force.
Seules des institutions, tant politiques que judiciaires, et une société civile et des médias toujours sur le qui-vive,
Only organizations outside of government and media always wary
peuvent tenter de maîtriser au mieux cette pulsion de violence qui niche au cœur de tout pouvoir et en la police et l'armée en s'en contrôle.
can try to control this violent impulse.
On voit que cette tâche est toujours d'actualité, même dans les pays à forte tradition de contrôle démocratique.
We see that this task is always contemporary, even in countries where governments are democratic.
Vous êtes bien placé ici pour le savoir.
You must know this here.
Alors, mais dans les pays non démocratiques, comme ceux d'où je viens,
In non-democratic countries like the one where I come from,
la situation est intrinsèquement plus grave encore.
the situation is definitely worse.
Le pouvoir ne s'y définit que comme pouvoir absolu,
Power is always absolute,
dans le temps et dans l'espace.
in time as in space.
Et la torture est une des données, est une des manières de montrer que le corps du citoyen appartient au chef.
And torture is one of the means of showing that the citizens belong to the chief.
Alors, il n'y a rien de nouveau dans ce que je dis ici.
Nothing is new in what I say here.
Mais le plus triste pour moi, c'est de découvrir ou de redécouvrir inlassablement
But the saddest thing for me is to discover or rediscover consistently
combien ce mépris des droits élémentaires de la personne humaine
how this contempt for the human person
s'accompagne d'une sorte de complicité résignée des populations.
always go with a resigned complicity of the population.
Alors, dans le cas d'un pays comme l'Algérie,
In the case of a country like Algeria,
il peut même y avoir une interprétation désastreuse de ce que j'appellerais le cours de l'histoire.
there can even be a disastrous interpretation of history.
Un certain nombre d'Algériens
A certain number of Algerians
pensent que la tragédie abominable qu'a connue le pays,
think that the terrible tragedy that the country has gone through,
avec plus de 200 000 morts,
with more than 200 dead,
est due au fond à l'introduction de l'exigence des droits de l'homme.
is because of the introduction of human rights.
Alors, in fact, I'm from a Mediterranean origin. It means that I would want to speak with my mouth, but also with my heart, with my body. And in fact, I will skip all the theoretical development. I want to tell you that I took part to the collection of testimonies. I saw people who were tortured. And the stranger thing when you see someone who was tortured is that you discover that he is like you. It means that you must be naive when we speak about torture. You must be inébranlable et naïf à la fois.
You must be unshakable.
In fact, we must agree on some very simple vérité. Et yes, the torture is the absolute evil. I was waiting for the translation. And yes, there is no justification to the use of torture. I'm a mathematician, but I tell you that you do not need justification of proof, of complicated proof to be convincing. It is sufficient only to imagine that it's you who are tortured. Our was that it is the person who loves the more, which is tortured. Your son, your daughter, your wife, your husband, or your father, or your mother. I'm always astonished by the amount of intelligence, of gifts, of which is gathered by all the governments to demonstrate that we can use in certain conditions the torture. We had to take only the precaution to name it with another word, mistreatment or something like that. But, and the problem is that sometimes, too often, people, ordinary people, are ready to accept, to abandon certain principles if they get what I call tranquility. In the case of Algeria, with more than 200,000 deaths, now when you speak about respect of human rights, sometimes they are considered as a provocateur. That, you know, it's people think that sometimes when you are tortured, it is because perhaps you have deserved it. As, for example, for the woman who is raped, sometimes you hear people who say that she perhaps deserved it, or perhaps she provoked it. And I try to be optimistic, but it is sometimes difficult to stay optimistic. But you have the choice between honor and dishonor. You have not, you don't need to prove. You have the choice, the dishonor or the honor. If you want to choose the honor, I speak about you, but I speak about my people, my country. The choice is simple. Excuse me for my very poor English.
Right between the poles that we've created here of the technical lawyer and the novelist is the investigative reporter. And so we're going to ask Jane to give her opening statement, talking about what it is to talk about something that happens in darkness and in secret, and what role language plays in that.
Thank you very much, everybody, for coming out tonight. It's wonderful to be with such esteemed colleagues in this issue. You know, before I came over here, someone said to me, well, they were hearing who the panelists were, and they said, well, who's the pro-torture person to balance it? And, you know, and I laughed too, but then I realized, you know, this is where we are as a country now. Torture is no longer 100% taboo. It's a subject you can actually debate in polite society and in places like Washington. And so I have to say, as a writer, most writers are very proud when they turn out a book. I think it's a tremendous shame that I had to write this book. It is astounding that there could be a book that had to be written about torture in a country that is founded on the principles of the Enlightenment and on the notion that all people are given inalienable rights by their creator, not just American people, but all people. So it's been a shame to have to tell this story. At the same time, people have often asked me, you know, how can you stand it? You know, don't you have nightmares, things like that. The dirty secret as a writer, at least for me, is that this has been completely, obsessively fascinating to write about. And it's been an unfolding mystery for me to figure out how this country became a country that embraced torture in dark rooms, and to try to piece the pieces of the puzzle together was so amazing. It made me enamored of a quote from Hannah Rent, in which he described the importance of writers in facing totalitarian states, which we are, I'm glad to say, I don't think in yet, but where she talked about that anti-democratic countries try to erase history, and the job of the writer is to capture that history and tell it, and go down those dark holes into the dark side, and tell about the dark, but also, and very importantly, to write the stories of the small and the big courageous acts of people who stood up and said, we're better than that along the way. Because it's those stories that you really want to pass on to the next generation. And as she put it, if we have, you can't expect everybody to do the right thing, but if there are a few people who do the right thing, we're still a civilization. And we need to pass on those stories. So in my book, and in writing about this, I've tried very hard to tell the stories of the people whose conscience came into a crisis over this program. And through them, to have readers feel just how much was at stake here. That this wasn't just about Republicans versus Democrats or some kind of silly political argument. This is a debate that I think goes to the soul of our country and what kind of civilization we are. And some of the people, I'm glad to say, who helped me tell that story because they stood up so courageously and admirably were Scott Horton and Lisa Massimino. So they're right here tonight, and I'm very glad to be with them. Lisa talked about the corruption of language. I think this has been one of the real difficulties in telling this story. While I was having a kind of a probably immorally interesting time putting this story together, the challenge was not just getting the story, but making readers care. And part of the reason was when you corrupt the language, it kind of, it corrupts more than just how you tell the story. It corrupts thought, really. And so when our government was telling us we don't torture, when in fact they were, it meant that the country never had an honest debate where we were asked, do you want to torture? Because people were never really given a chance to think about this in a candid and honest way. And they took that away from the country when they took the language away from the country. So as a writer and trying to get people to care, the challenge has been to restore the shock value of what an awful thing this was. And in thinking about that, I think that it was important not to do the obvious thing. What one would think you would do then would be to sort of jump up and down and be emotional and preach. And in fact, I think that would have been exactly the wrong thing to do. I think in order to reach readers, it was very important to be nonpartisan, not preachy, but in fact to find credible voices who were, if anything, politically unexpected. Which is why when I write about torture, I often quote the FBI saying, we can't do this or we're going to lose our soul. I turn to many military figures who you think of as being conservative and very sort of patriotic in a kind of a, obvious way. And when they speak out, I think I can get to readers beyond the sort of little amen chorus. And one of the things that Human Rights First has done is pull together a tremendous group of retired generals and admirals and others who have spoken out, and they have tremendous credibility. The other thing that's been very hard about getting people to care is that the kind of torture program that this was is something called no-touch torture, which means it's torture that doesn't create blood. It's not something that's like pulling people's fingernails out. It's not like 24 and Jack Bauer, which is what you think traditionally of torture. So it's been a leap of imagination. It requires people to really think about what it means to be kept awake for days and days on end, or to be put in a stressed position. Things that don't sound so awful, but being kept in isolation. It's been very hard as a writer to convey what this did to people. And the best way I could do it was finally to get access to one or two people who've gone through this program and give their experience some kind of voice. But the government has kept us as journalists away from most of these people. The one or two that I've met, Khalid al-Masri, whose rendition it had some tremendous emotional impact on me to see him. He was the first person I'd seen who'd been renditioned. And to see, as I interviewed him, I just was trying to get a few details about his experience. He started to cry. And to see somebody sitting over a cup of coffee with you, a car salesman from Germany, just falling apart, remembering what he went through, I felt, I need to somehow get this across to people so they understand these aren't others. These, as he said, they really are just like us. And I think that, with different names, different races, and different religions, it's been very hard to convey that. But I do actually feel somewhat optimistic that we're turning the corner. Both of the nominees in the last presidential race were, I think, truly anti-torture as opposed to the people in government saying we don't torture now. And I think it's an incredible privilege to be a writer and to be part of that change.
Thank you, Jenny. Everyone on this panel has at least flicked at the slipperiness of language and the slow devolution of the conversation about torture that wasn't about torture, it was about harsh interrogation, robust interrogation, aggressive interrogation, and sometimes I think even slipperier it turned into fraternity pranks. What happened at Abu Ghraib was just kind of like hazing. Waterboarding was described rather cavalierly as a dump. So I wonder if part of the problem we're having, and that Jane refers to, and that Elisa refers to, in terms of engendering a sense that torture happened, has to do with how cavalierly we can change language. And I'm thinking of that juxtaposed against the images from Abu Ghraib, which really knocked people out. And I wonder if anyone on the panel wants to respond to the simplicity of a black and white photo that is very tough to argue with, as compared to second, third, fourth hand, thanks to Jane, at least finally first-hand accounts that tend to, I think, very quickly flow into very, very ambiguous and slippery language and raise the question that maybe it's not really torture after all. Does anyone have?
I just think, I hate to say it, but it's humbling to a writer to see how much more power an image can have. Try as we might, it was very hard to have the impact that those photographs had. And I don't think it's surprising that the CIA trashed the videotapes of people being waterboarded, because I was told by someone who did see them, if they'd ever gotten out, the reaction would have been, as you put it, unmanageable. So it's one thing to hold a dunk in the water, and it's another thing to see what it really looked like. And so I think that, and it's also not very surprising that when they did get rid of those videotapes, it was right after the Abu Ghraib photographs came out, and somebody said to me, we had an uh-oh moment as they remembered they had the videos. The tremendous power that these photos have. I think there are a lot more photos that we've never been able to see, and I'm hoping that maybe one of the things that happens next is we get to the archives.
Does anyone else get that?
Maybe you should put it under the heading of complicity, as you raised this theme earlier, because I think there was a complicity with the administration and its torture policy that was played out, particularly in the media. The media in the United States took their cue from the White House and from the Pentagon that you may not call this torture. You'll use other words for it. And that shift in language was the first barrier of defense that the administration was able to put in place protecting its policies. And I think you make a correct point here, pointing to the photographs. There's no question why Donald Rumsfeld and his Pentagon felt that they had to scapegoat those dozen young NCOs because those photographs were out there. People saw it, people understood what was going on. They had to make an affirmative point that this had nothing to do with the policies put in place by the Pentagon, and they used the court-martials as a vehicle for doing that. Now, let's look at that Levin McCain report. It says explicitly that was a lie. The abuse that occurred at Abu Ghraib flowed directly from those policy decisions that Rumsfeld put in place with presidential authorization. Yeah, and I note in my article in Harper's, when I, at the beginning, after those photographs were first published, I was invited two times in the course of just a few weeks to appear on the News Hour with Jim Lehr, which is, a news broadcast that supposedly is extremely serious and offers in-depth discussions of these things. And in my preparatory discussions with their editors, I was told repeatedly, well, of course you can feel free to use the word torture when you're talking about concepts and policies at an abstract level. But you should be very cautious about using that term to refer to things that were actually done by the military at Abu Ghraib. That would be rushing to conclusions. That would really be inappropriate. So the cue is very clear. If you want to be a guest in that program, you're going to observe these language rules, and I observed over the course of months. In fact, all the people who appeared on their program and all the others observed these same sorts of rules. So this is not coincidental. This is an exercise in self-censorship. I think a lot of the problem we have relates to that. And even if you look at the reporting that occurred on the Levin McCain report issued just last week, you'll see about a 1,200-word article about it published in the New York Times, an article roughly the same length of the Washington Post. And in both of these articles, the word torture doesn't appear. All these techniques which are clearly torture, and they're being acknowledged as torture, that's one of the conclusions of the report, they're being described as highly coercive interrogation techniques. This is an example of words dropping like little drops of arsenic in our body politic. There was not enough people who stood up and resisted this, and I'm afraid that includes our community of journalists and writers.
About the Abu Ghraib photographs, I think while it's true that there was universal rejection of that, all the way up to the White House, and disgust, I think we have to ask ourselves why, given when those came out and there was such an outcry, yet we weren't able to, in the immediate aftermath of that, actually have a challenge the policies that led to those abuses. And the previous presidential campaign didn't deal with those things at all. Never came up. And, I have asked myself that a lot. Why, at that moment, that should have been the moment when we made the most progress on reform of the policies. And I think one of the reasons is that while almost everybody was disgusted by those photographs, many people were not disgusted by them because they thought it was torture. They were disgusted by the sexual nature of them, the nudity, and they were repulsed by them. But if you started to get in, and they said, "Oh, we don't do that. That's not us. We don't do that." But I don't think we were successful in using that as a way of talking about the torture that leaves no marks. And so I think that's still a real challenge for us. One of the keys to doing that, I think, and in terms of how you open up that space to get people to, for me, the challenge as an advocate is to create that kind of cognitive dissonance so that people can see themselves from outside, is to stop talking about the definitions and just start talking about what other regimes have done, and regimes that are universally condemned by the United States and the world community, and see how similar the techniques are to those very ones that we engaged in. And that tends to twist things just enough to open up the possibility of admitting that what we've done is torture.
I think in some ways it's a mistake to get too hung up on the semantics of whether it's torture or not torture. And the person who made this point eloquently to me was Alberto Mora, who was the general counsel of the Navy, and who was one of the first people to stand up to Rumsfeld in some ways, in some way on the inside. But his point was, it doesn't matter if it's torture or cruelty. Deliberate cruelty against unarmed people in our custody is just as morally repugnant, and you really have to get that point across and not get distracted by the, some of these. This was a program that was sanctioned by lawyers, and it's very easy to get sort of caught up in their games. And I think it's a mistake in some ways to get all, distracted by it.
I just, oh, go ahead.
I want to give an example of how, for example, the Algerian government succeeded in this transformation of the vocabulary. A small number of victims of torture succeeded in having their injury recognized by the Algerian state. And they got compensation, but as victims of workplace accidents. You have heard workplace accidents. And these victims, some of them wounded for life, suffer painfully from the cruel irony of having been assigned to this administrative category, injured in the workplace of the security forces. The other tool for the government is the amnesty. When the amnesty is the tool used by very frequently by Algerian authorities. Each time there are great. I promise you, I will try to ameliorate my English. À chaque fois qu'il y a des problèmes en Algérie, il y a une campagne pour faire admettre au peuple qu'il est nécessaire de repartir à nouveau et donc de faire une amnistie.
Each time there are problems in Algeria, there is a campaign for people to go back and create amnesty.
On essaie de convaincre le peuple que bon, il y a eu des erreurs commises dans le passé, mais que nous allons repartir d'un pas nouveau. J'espère que ce n'est pas ce qu'ils voulaient.
Each time the government tries to convince the people that they have to go back and start on the new footing, and I hope this is not happening to you.
I'm going to ask one more quick question, then I want to open it up to questions. And Jane has to leave, but we thank her so much for being here. And of course, because she has to leave, I have a question that directly refers to stuff she's written about, but I think we can manage nevertheless. And I have been struck by how eloquently she and others have written about the culture, about the possibility that our culture, in all sorts of different ways, has not actually thrown up its hands in revulsion, but has in fact come to sort of normalize torture over the last 8 years.
I can speak to that a little bit. One of the things that my organization has done is focus on the way that torture is portrayed in popular culture. And in fact, talked a lot to Jane about what we were learning as we were interviewing interrogators who were coming back from Afghanistan and Iraq. And they were telling us that in the absence of the Geneva Conventions, which they were told didn't apply, they were told to be aggressive and be creative. And many of them had DVDs of shows like 24 and Lost with them. And some of them actually got creative by watching those shows. We were surprised when we called the Dean of West Point to see if he was interested in learning more about this, and he said, Jack Bauer is my biggest problem in training. Everybody wants to be like him. And so we took him and some other retired military, out to Los Angeles to meet with the writers and producers of 24 and some other shows. They had never spoken to a real interrogator, ever. Dean Finnegan had his uniform on when we went to the set of 24, and people thought he was an extra. You can see the pictures if you want to go up on our website. It's pretty funny. But they, their attitude was, these are just the sick musings of, our minds, our kind of dark fantasies about what we would like to do, revenge fantasies, many of them. And I think it really tapped into a wide vein in the American public, both anger and a feeling of frustration about not knowing how to, feeling like we had been made fools of by 9/11, wanting to get back, and also just in a context of fear that was constantly being ramped up by the administration, and desired a wish fantasy that this would work. Wouldn't it be great, one of the writers said, if torture really did work, because it would be so easy, we could really stop terrorism. And so I think that is part of the way that people, there's the ticking time bomb scenario, and the way that people feel like that's a scenario that people really worry about. When we met with the presidential candidates during the campaign with the military people, they all asked about this. What do I tell people about the ticking time bomb? Everyone wants to believe that if we could just look the other way and put our, scruples aside, we could actually save civilization as we know it, instead of destroy it. And so I think that's, part of the reason why there's been this erosion of outrage about these things, because people are afraid and they wish this would work.
Scott, if you can go quick.
Well, I want to say the corruption of American popular culture on this score is really astonishing, worthy of a good study. Elisa's group has done a bit, but if you look back at World War II, the United States, 1943, issued a poster that says, "Torture, tool of the enemy." If you look at films that came out during the war and in the 1950s, torture was a tool used by enemies of our country, and its victims were innocent people, especially American service personnel. What's happened in the age of Bush? Torture is a tool of choice of the United States. Torture is heroic. Torture is ennobling. Look at Jack Bauer. This is not coincidental. Jane documented this brilliantly in her article 24. There are tight links between the producer of 24 at Fox News, of course Fox News and Fox, you know all about their connections with the Bush administration, but the producers of this show have very tight connections to Vice President Cheney and to the Bush administration. The Heritage Foundation did a whole fete for them with a dinner, very tightly connected. Another interesting point just to note there, quite recently, Lieutenant Colonel Diane Beaver, the woman who wrote the original memorandum that went up that resulted in the torture order issued by Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld. Where did she come up with those techniques? Well, she told Philippe Sands, it's reported in his book, The Torture Team, she got it from watching 2 seasons worth of DVDs of 24. Direct connection there. And Sands, after the book was published, recently published a series of email communications back and forth with a writer at 24 who described being horrified when he saw what it was he was up to and what he was trying to do. He described his pushback with the directors of the program, and what did he hear from them? No, our mission is to legitimize and support the policies of this administration. There's nothing coincidental about this. It's a political plan with a political purpose, and that needs to be observed.
Thank you. So we have time for not as many questions as I'm sure you have, but before I take questions, we are lucky enough to have Lisa Magarel from the International Center for Transitional Justice, who's been doing some hard thinking on the issue of truth and reconciliation reconciliation, which is where Scott had started this discussion. So I wondered, Lisa, if you would like to just take 2 minutes and tell us where you are at.
Also to, sorry. That's all right, I don't want to spend the time. But to greet all of you and let you know that in the back of the room, there are some copies of documents that we produced, both on the question of a commission of inquiry and also on the rumored pardon that Bush might issue before the end of his term. And if you don't see them there, you can find them on our website, www.ictj.org. I really just want to comment briefly on a couple of things. First, the language. I think, working internationally in countries that have gone through armed conflict or have come through a period of repression and massive systematic abuses of human rights, I'm familiar with a lot of language that human rights communities use there. Impunity, human rights abuses, and finding myself in the United States, which actually is my country as well, or you can't really talk in those terms here. Extraordinary rendition, I think it's forced disappearance. And, so this sort of language of human rights that I'm very familiar with, and that there is a large community of people around the world struggling against impunity and for recognition of these rights, I find it still somewhat shocking to find how little that language is used, appreciated, and has an echo in this country. So I think we have a long way to go. And I think part of that has to do with fear. And I think there are specific tools that are used to engender fear and to cover up what's happened in the past. But I think that President Obama will have, I think, a good effect on this one element of why we're able to lead on these topics. Finally, I also just want to make a couple of points about particularly the question of images and how one hears the story of what is happening, what is torture. And I find that in commissions, truth commissions that I've observed and participated in different settings around the world and some in the United States, that listening to victims who have been through this is one way to bring that very vividly to the fore. And I think Jane described what it's like sitting and talking with someone who has been tortured. And while you're not seeing the image, you're seeing its signs in the person that is left behind. And I think it's a very strong image that can help us understand. So I do think that truth-telling is an important part of this, and I want to say that I think we need to be very careful not to assume that truth-telling displaces criminal justice. I think Scott made this point very well. And there are several options for how to go about truth-telling. We talk about these in our reports, I won't repeat them here. But public hearings can be a part of that, and they need to include in some way stories from victims. I think we have some information through the digging that journalists and writers have done and through congressional reports like the ones that have been mentioned. But I think these give us sort of a fractured, piecemeal view. And we need to be thinking, how do we uncover and paint that picture of the systemic abuse, the failures of the system? Not because we need to pass new laws, but because we need to understand how these laws have not been put into practice and why. And finally, that we should think about this need to go back and look at what has happened very deeply and very honestly, not as a backward-looking exercise, but really as something that we need to take us forward into a new era, we hope, in which there will be respect for human rights, and we can maybe talk about human rights in those terms and think about building a more popular understanding of the need to stand up for those when they are being abused. So I want to make those points, and again remind you that if you want to find the papers that we've done and some of our research, it's on our website at www.ictj.org. Thanks for giving me the chance to speak.
All right. Questions, and try to make them as quick as you can. Gentlemen over here. Do we have a mic? Okay, we have 2 mics, so.
Thank you. I'd like to ask Mr. Horton whether he's really thought through the business of the shape of prosecution. When you say Pat Fitzgerald, that's just what we really don't want. Because as good as he is, he didn't report. He just made his charges and didn't tell us why he didn't charge others. And at the end of the criminal investigation process, we need the kind of report that we used to have under the Independent Counsel Act.
Thank you. Well, I'll say, we used to have an independent counsel statute that provided for counsel to be appointed by court to conduct this, and also at some point to issue a report, although I think there were all sorts of issues about that. That statute has lapsed, so there's no basis for it in the current law. The basis that would exist for appointment of counsel is it's basically regulations, internal regulations of the Department of Justice that allow an Attorney General to appoint a special prosecutor when there's a conflict that would prevent one of the current prosecutors from serving. I think that's the case here because the Department of Justice itself has emerged as a major crime scene. When we look at the things that happen in connection with the introduction of torture, it involves the Office of the Attorney General, the Deputy Attorney General, the Office of Legal Counsel, the head of the Criminal Division, the head of the National Security Section. We don't know how deep down it goes, but the Department of Justice is going to be a major focus of the investigation, so it needs to be an outsider. But I think the process is key here, and I view this as a situation where I know the bank was robbed. There's a crime. But I don't know who should be charged exactly for what crimes. And I think that has to be handled by competent process with a career prosecutor who has all the necessary tools to do it and the right incentive to enforce and uphold the law. And that's where I come up with Patrick Fitzgerald, who's someone I have a great deal of confidence in to do this.
The woman in the beige sweater.
I really identify with Lisa, is that correct? Remark about how to make American people understand the issues at stake here. And that brings me to the discussion about extraordinary remission that Mr. Burton so well brought up as one of the first comments he made. I think we make a mistake in talking about extraordinary remission as an equivalency to torture. It's as if we're saying that to render someone in the way it's being done now, as long as there are assurances of no torture at the other end, or in fact, we can prove there was no torture at the other end, that the rendition in itself was okay, it's not a violation of human rights. I consider rendition itself to be a gross violation of international law. And I think we should be starting to talk to the American people about it, about rendition itself, not even connected to torture. They should imagine that their next door neighbor from 1 hour to the next disappears for 7 years. His family doesn't know where he is. There are rumors that he's being physically harmed. I think that kind of thing would allow Americans to see how fundamental rights here are at issue. So I wonder if any of the panelists have comments on that. And just one odd comment. I hear that this coming season of 24, Jack Bauer is going to be brought before Congress to be held accountable for his crime. And I'm just hoping that, just like in past years, the torture on 24 and the torture by our government were paralleling one another, that the accountability on 24 will be paralleled by our government officials' accountability before the law.
Yeah, don't count on that. Don't count on that. What we've heard is that they'll be vindicated, and that they're going to use the season. I'm looking for a walk-on by Vice President Cheney myself. What we've heard is that it will be brought before a congressional committee, and it will be proven that the politicians were all, callowly catering to the public's revulsion at these tactics, but it turns out that he saves the day. And in the process, if you saw the 2-hour teaser show a few weeks ago, they will trash the UN. Just as a bonus.
We literally have time for one more question, right over here. Yeah, you. And grab the mic if you would.
I'll shout. I couldn't be more supportive of the cause against torture, but I'll play devil's advocate for just a moment, hopefully not too terribly simplistic manner.
Please use the mic.
Use the mic. Yeah, I want to make the point that I hope I'm not too terribly simplistic in my question, but Anwar eloquently made the point that to understand the horror of torture, you need only imagine yourself or a loved one experiencing that. But you can flip that around and imagine that many of us would be tolerant or even be willing to commit torture ourselves to save ourselves or to save a loved one. And unfortunately, in today's world, and here in New York, and after September 11th, this is a very real issue for many people. So again, don't take me wrong. I'm supportive of all your views, but I'm just curious how you respond to that, and how we, respond to that as we face these discussions about torture in our daily lives with people who disagree with us.
You have posed a real question. The question is the following. The things the terrorists have done, for example in Algeria, was so horrible that the reaction was generally that these people deserve to be tortured because what they did is so horrible that even torture this person will not be equal to what they did. It is the problem of we have. I'm going to be raised as mankind is to resist to the temptation to do to the enemy of mankind what they did. The level of morality in Algeria against torture has fallen because of the war against terrorism. I don't know, the answer is not simple. Because, for example, the things the terrorists have done in Algeria, for example, as burning babies, etc., are so unimaginable that the temptation to consider these people as non-human is so big that you can even in French. The temptation to use torture against enemies of mankind is very strong. But civilization is what can be defined in how to stay human in front of humanless. Humanlessness. And it is not an easy response to give to somebody who, for example, has lost people he lost, for example, 9/11 in Algeria, people who lost parents, etc. But it is the sole response we can give.
So did I.
You know what? You may. Yeah, go ahead. And then this really has to be. Microphone. Can you take the microphone, please?
I belong to an organization called 9/11 Families for Peaceful Tomorrows. We're the only one of the 9/11 families groups that was against the war in Iraq and for peace and justice and bringing those who committed 9/11 to justice, not revenge. We have constantly had problems with the press here, like last week when Khalid Sheikh Mohammed and 4 others were in a hearing in Guantanamo. 5 people from the 9/11 families were allowed to go to Guantanamo. It was supposedly a lottery, but the Office of Military Commissions just happened to pick Sally Reaganhart and a bunch of others who are very much pro-administration. And they were quoted like crazy in the newspapers. We got together, not only our organization, but others who were not in our organization, who also feel that revenge is the answer. And we did a letter that was, unfortunately, I was out of town. I don't know if it was published. The ACLU sent it out for us. But there are plenty of people who lost someone in 9/11 who do not feel we have to kill others. Just the opposite. We have tried to publicize civilian casualties in Afghanistan and in Iraq, because that's what we don't believe in. We've started an international network of families of victims for that purpose, to show how people suffer from this and that we should not be doing to others as they've done unto us. And also, well, one thing is, torture doesn't work. Anybody will say anything if they're up to torture enough. It's silly.
Thank you. And please know that there's panelists, wine, cheese, so you have plenty of opportunity to talk to the panelists individually. I want to just introduce to say goodnight Larry Seams, the director of Freedom to Write, an international program with the Pan American Center, to conclude the evening.
Thank you so much. Please join me again in thanking this wonderful Before we adjourn to the reception, I should thank a few other people on behalf of PEN, the American Constitution Society, our great partners in the event, Judson Memorial Church for this great space and for all their great programming, my colleague Elizabeth Weinstein and our outstanding and wonderful volunteers, Ryan Davidson, Lindsay Dowswell, Sherry Jones, Nicholas Tack, Victoria McCoy, Clavis Natera, Jenna Pileski, Suzanne Ruta, and Ellen Snooks for lending a hand tonight. And finally, most importantly, thank you all for coming. Czeslaw Milosz, in his great book, The Captive Mind, describes what happens to ordinary citizens in countries that are crossing over to the dark side. He finds he acquires new habits quickly. Once, had he stumbled upon a corpse in the street, he would have called the police. A crowd would have gathered, and much talk and comment would have ensued. Now he knows he must avoid the dark body lying in the gutter and refrain from asking unnecessary questions. The man who fired the gun must have had his reasons. He makes himself believe no atrocities are being committed. One murders only those who must be murdered, tortures only those who must be made to confess, deports only those who must be deported. As a PEN member and as a citizen, I'm proud to be in this room full of people who refuse to refrain from asking unnecessary questions. I want to encourage you all to continue to make your voices heard. You've received sample letters on your chairs. Please take a moment to send letters to the President-elect, urging him to carry through on his pledges to end torture and other abuses, and asking him to oversee a process like the one we've been talking about this evening. Albert Camus, who opposed independence for Algeria, but who unequivocally condemned the use of torture in the Algerian War, wrote in 1958, "Reprisals against civilian populations and the use of torture are crimes in which we are all involved. The fact that such things could take place among us is a humiliation we must henceforth face. And censorship, always stupid, whether resulting from shame or cynicism, will not change anything about these truths. The government's duty is not to suppress protests against the criminal excesses of oppression. Its duty, rather, is to suppress the excesses and to condemn them publicly in order to keep each individual citizen from feeling personally responsible for the actions of a few." Thank you all. Please join PEN. Please join us in the back of the room. Thank you very much.
Yourself
Okay.
Lisa Massimino.
Okay, you can edit it if it
Yeah, and you can do
a little bit.
You can do a couple
If
you
it's
get it off
okay.
bad or whatever. Yeah, we can cut it and just a couple of words. It doesn't have to be
Yep.
long.
Okay. I'll give it a try.
Okay.
Okay, but if
What
I
do you
can
need?
move backwards.
Do you want me to so you can see?
Yeah, I was gonna maybe do something like that. And,
I can't believe I have to be on camera when I look so bad. It's not fair.
Not true at all.
It's not fair.
Then again, I've
Walking
never
around in the snow for like half an
I've
hour.
actually seen you before, but
My hair's still wet, I think.
Right. We can put a little bar on the bottom.
Doesn't usually look this way. Is getting a haircut tomorrow.
You can tell us the headshot. We can put that up. And
so you will look at me so you don't
Okay.
have to look into
Yeah.
the scary glass in the camera.
Okay.
And
actually, I'm not.
I'm just gonna say who I am and what writers can
this
do.
seems to be just something that, yes.
Right?
Yeah. Okay. And yeah, go right ahead.
Great. My name's Elisa Massimino, and I'm the Executive Director of Human Rights First. We have an anti-torture campaign going on, and you can learn more about it from our website at www.humanrightsfirst.org. One of the most important things that writers can do to help advance the agenda, the anti-torture agenda, is to write. Write to your members of Congress, write to President-elect Obama and the transition team, and write for the public to reclaim the language that has been so debased by the current administration. This is a huge challenge for Americans to understand what it is that has been done in our name and how we can make sure that it never happens again. And writers have a very important role to play in that. Something.
Yeah, that
See
was
how that, is that okay?
lovely. That was very much. Thank you very much.
direct to the point.
See what you can do.
Included a website, most importantly.
Thank you very much.
Thanks. Kind of a nice shot right here. This podium with a shadow.
Yeah. Now we can tackle the issue going forward, more geared toward what writers can do on a very direct basis, whether it's op-eds, addressing language, whatever it is that you want to.
Okay, got it.
And Antonio will stand here and you'll look at
You can look at a little bit. He's a real person. Okay.
Just say when.
Okay.
Go right ahead.
Okay. My name is Scott Horton. I'm a contributing editor at Harper's Magazine, and I'm here at this event that was just set up by the Pan American Center to address the torture issue and what writers can do to address it. And I'd just offer you a few thoughts, parting thoughts as we leave today. I'd focus on history, I think. Today, with the change of administrations in Washington, we're going to hear this refrain over and over that says, let bygones be bygones. Let's just not pursue what happened in the past. Let's embrace the new president. And let
30 seconds to a minute. Thank you.
Should we go back to the beginning, or how do you want to do this? From the beginning.
Medium beginning. No, I think we can go right into saying the bygones beyond what people can do to insist that. If you want to, I think that's where it starts for me.
So with the transition in Washington, we're all going to be hearing this refrain, let bygones be bygones. Let's not dig into the past. Let's just embrace and support this new administration in Washington. That would be a big mistake, and I'll tell you why. We need to understand our own history. And as Jim Lehr just said in this meeting, quoting Hannah Arendt, it is the practice of a totalitarian or wannabe totalitarian state to cover up, to edit, to recraft the past. For a democracy that really wants to function as a democracy and wants to overcome mistakes of the past, that process starts with understanding what happened. Who did what decisions were taken, why, what was done in the authority or on the authority of the government. We as citizens need to know all those facts, and once we know them, we may very well demand accountability for some of the things that happened in the past. And I think only in this way can we move on. It's a matter of redemption of the past, as Chekhov said in The Cherry Orchard. It's a matter of overcoming a past legacy. It's a matter of learning from past mistakes. Because what's essential right now is not that we move on, but that we learn from what happened in the past. And as John McCain said last week, this can never happen again. Never. That'll only be true if we know exactly what it is that happened. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Thank you.
Super.
I have to get all the propaganda.
Yes,